Welcome everyone to our Venus retrograde cycle in Scorpio Libra. Thank you for joining us. As you can see, Venus is going to be retrograde from October 5th through November 16th. It's going to go retrograde at about 11 degrees Scorpio until 25 degrees Libra. First of all, though, our good old housekeeping slide. Here at EAN, you can study with us 3 different ways. You can listen to our free weekly audio podcast on whatever's coming up in the world of forecasting, astrology. You can subscribe to our Astro Library. You see the 3 different sections on your screen. You can subscribe for 1 month, 6 months, 12 months, or you can do a monthly recurring that can be canceled at any time. And of course, you can enroll in our Evolutionary Astrology course and study EA with us. You see 3 different segments there on your screen. If you want more information, you can give us a phone call. You can contact us at our website that you see on your screen. Let's get started. I got a lot of slides. So this Venus retrograde cycle is Scorpio back to Libra. Here on your screen, you can see that it's going to spend 5 months in just 2 signs of the zodiac. Venus will be in Libra for 2 months, 66 days. It'll be in Scorpio for 3 months, 89 days. You can see the dates there on your screen. Obviously, we've had Venus in Scorpio since September 9th. Oh, you're not muted, babe. Thank you. You're not muted. Somebody can't get on the webinar. Somebody new. All right, sorry about that. As you can see, Venus has already been in Scorpio since September 9th, and it's been slowing down here as it's getting ready to turn retrograde. We're recording this 2 days before Venus goes retrograde. Here are the dates and degrees that are most significant in this Venus retrograde cycle. Here's where Venus went into its pre-shadow, September 2nd, first time at 25 Libra. And again, retrograde, the highlight of the retrograde cycle, which we'll talk about. And here's where Venus goes direct, November 16th at 25 Libra again. And here's when it leaves post-shadow, December 17th at about 11 degrees Scorpio. We'll look at this slide 1 or 2 more times here as we go through this webinar. I also want to point out that in this specific retrograde cycle, if you have signs planets between 0 and 11 degrees of the fixed modality, which is Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, Aquarius, then you're going to have some of these hard aspects to those planets from the Venus retrograde cycle. If you have planets from 25 to 30 degrees of the cardinal modality, Aries, Cancer, Libra, Capricorn, same thing. If you have planets between 0 and 11 degrees of the water element, which is Cancer, Scorpio, Pisces, you get the conjunction or trines. 25 to 30 degrees of air elements, which is Gemini, Libra, Aquarius, you get the conjunction and trines as well. So if you're a little bit new to the study of astrology, this is just a little review here of the degrees and signs of the zodiac where you would look for natal planets that would be the most impacted, again, by this Venus retrograde cycle. Venus astronomy quickly. It only takes 225 days to go around the sun, but its revolution around the zodiac is anywhere between 9 to 14 months, and it's that expanded because it only has a retrograde cycle once every year and a half. This is the rarest of the retrograde cycles. Venus is only retrograde 7% of the time, 40 to 43 days. When it turns stationary retrograde or stationary direct, it appears to stand still in the sky for 2 days. And many of us might be becoming familiar with the Venus five-pointed star or pentagram. In other words, every 8 years, we'll have 5 Venus retrograde cycles, and it will make a five-pointed star in the zodiac. And if we would take 1 point, let's just say Venus retrograde once every 8 years in Scorpio, Libra, every time it turns retrograde, it'll happen 2 to 3 days earlier from the 8 years before, and it'll happen 2 to 3 degrees earlier from the previous cycle 8 years ago. And what happens then is it ends up taking about 104 years for Venus to reverse through a sign of the zodiac, 30 degrees, and each point of that pentagram. Let me show you as a visual, all right? Here we are at this point with Venus going retrograde, Scorpio, Libra. The next one will be in Gemini, then Aquarius, Capricorn, Leo, Virgo. The last one we had in early 2017 was Aries, Pisces. So those are the 5 points of the pentagram that Venus makes with its retrograde cycles every 8 years. Here's the last time Venus was retrograde in Scorpio, Libra, 2010, 2002, 94, 86, 78, etc. Now, there are many who feel that this 100 years to reverse through a sign relates to the fairy tale of Sleeping Beauty, where she goes to sleep for 100 years and is awakened by the kiss. I went onto Wikipedia and looked up the myths and the old Sleeping Beauty fairy tales. Yuck. We really have glossed it over for Disney movies today. There's 2 main myths, and neither one of them are very nice, sweet little fairy tales. You can go look that up on Wikipedia if you are interested. There's also another fairy tale that relates to Venus as well. I'll show you that one in just a moment. Here's the biggest thing, though, about this particular Venus retrograde cycle. When Venus disappears into the underworld because it's so close to the sun, and then comes back up in its retrograde cycle as a morning star, it's called the heliacal rising. This will be the first time that Venus rises in the sign of Libra. So that 104-year cycle, rising as a morning star, reversing through the sign of Libra for that century, this is the first one. So this takes on a little bit more significance than, say, the Venus retrograde cycle in 2010 or the one that's going to come in 2026. And so I thought the intent of this, here's all of these Libran words: fairness, equality, balance in any area of life, not just relationships. Of course, equality in relationships will include equality between genders and equality between same genders, but we have a little bit of this gender inequality between male and female in the news lately. And so isn't it interesting that we're at this point in the Venus pentagram? Again, heliacal rising as a morning star is changing signs from Scorpio to Libra. So this is valuing and evolving all relationships individually and collectively. And I thought, this too may be another one of those signs where we're having to recognize the global village. This difference between one region of the country and another, between one country and another country, between one continent and another continent. The world's getting smaller and smaller. Now, we're not guaranteed that we're going to align with all of these natural archetypes. We can distort it, and we can bring out even more extremes of imbalance and inequality, and gender and racial cruelty. How loud does it have to get before enough people wake up and go, could we do this a different way, please? So remember this tidbit. This is an important one in the Venus retrograde cycle. Here's the mythology. And this is coming from Daniel Giamario and Caitlin Caslin. Can't remember his business partner's name quite correctly, but I've followed shamanic astrology by Daniel for a number of years, and he's the one who's really brought back this old way of how our ancestors would actually look at Venus in the sky. And so Venus has a 584-day shamanic death and rebirth cycle. So as we get to November 1st, and Venus has its heliacal rising as a morning star, that will last 8 to 9 months. And Venus is going to be moving ahead of the sun. So if you get up early enough, you'll see Venus in the darkened sky, and then it will fade as the sun rises. And this 29 degrees Libra is going to be the ruling overtone for the next Venus cycle, the next 19 months. Now, as Venus is a morning star, there will be 7, sometimes there's 8, but typically 7 waning Moon-Venus morning conjunctions. And Venus is going to rise and set with these 7 conjunctions before it descends into the underworld. And so let me just point out, and Venus, when it's retrograde, is between the sun and earth. When Venus is a morning star and then disappears, it's going to disappear for 2 to 3 months. That's when it's on the far side of the sun. And we actually have the sun in the middle with Earth on one side, Venus on the other. Now, in the mythology, or I said fairy tales before, but really mythology, Venus is a morning star in the 7 moon conjunctions, is releasing something, and it's Venus dying off to her or its old self. And then when it goes into that underworld for the long time period, a couple of months, that's the death by intent of Venus. And then Venus will come back as an evening star for the next 8 to 9 months. And this is going to be 7, sometimes 8, waxing Moon-Venus conjunctions as Venus rises and then sets in the sky. This is the part of the Venus cycle that we have been watching. So for those of you over this summer who've been looking at Moon-Venus conjunctions in the evening sky, this is what you're seeing. And these waxing conjunctions are known as Venus gathering a vestment or gathering wisdom and insights with each conjunction to the moon. So what do we have now? Venus is going to go retrograde, and we're going to have a birth by intent. In other words, as Venus goes retrograde and then again disappears from the horizon into the underworld, it's only going to be there for a week, and then it's going to come back up as a morning star. That's the death by intent. So you'll have this to look at, and you can go to Daniel Giamario's website, Shamanic Astrology. They write a lot about this. I'm pointing out more the astronomy and just tidbits of the mythology for you. If you want more information, again, you can go to shamanicastrology.com. Because I live in the Northern Plains and have watched the evening sky so much, I'm always interested in how we view it out there in the heavens, rather than how we just look at it from the perspective of our little computer screens. Okay, archetypal Venus. Venus actually rules 2 signs at this point in astrology. Venus's rulership of Taurus in the 2nd house is the inner side of Venus. These are all the self words. self-acceptance, self-love, self-sex, self-reliance, self-worth, self-empowerment. This is the survival instinct following Aries, where we need the food, clothing, and shelter to actually physically survive. But it will also include any resources beyond survival that go into beauty, art, etc. Venus's values. Here, it's what do we value in regards to food, clothing, and shelter, or those physical resources that we consider to be our essential needs. This inner side of Venus also rules the 5 senses: touch, smell, taste, sight, hearing. And of course, some of the distortions that you'll hear of this Taurus second house rulership: hoarding, stubbornness, possessiveness, indulgent, poverty, prostitution, isolation, materialistic. Venus, however, also rules Libra and 7th house. This is the outer side of Venus. Taurus, 2nd house, relationship with self. Libra, 7th house, relationship with others. And this is all those relationships outside of ourself, beyond a casual acquaintance, as I like to say. We also here will find relationship diversity. This is where not this, yes to that. We compare and contrast ourselves with others to learn more about ourselves. I like this, I don't like that. This is where we have the psychology of listening, being able to deeply hear what someone else is saying. And then we can understand where they're coming from. And then this leads to being able to give and receive as another wants to be given to. And when someone's deeply listening to us, they will give to us as we wish to be given to. Now, this giving and receiving will include when to give and when to not give. We can go overboard and give, and wonder why the partner does not love us back. We're not having healthy boundaries. We're not being fair and equal. Distortions here: inequality, codependency, projections, expectations, idealism, projecting those ideals out there, wearing masks, lack of boundaries again, going to extremes, being a philanderer. We can be possessive here as well, and we can also be needy here as well. Now, why do we have planetary retrogrades briefly? It is an Earth-centered or geocentric phenomena, and it's apparent motion. We live in a heliocentric universe. The planets move around the sun, but from planet Earth, they appear to slow down, go backwards for a while before they go direct again. And so, whenever a planet is retrograde, that's when it is going to be closest to planet Earth. So as I said, Venus is retrograde. It's going to travel between Earth and the sun. That's why it looks so bright as an evening star right now, or over the course of this summer. Planetary retrogrades, from an archetypal understanding, give us an opportunity to break free from consensus conditionings. Any planetary retrograde causes us to withdraw from status quo so that we can define that planetary archetype according to what is natural for us as an individual. So those planetary retrogrades draw us inward to get the lessons and answers from within ourselves. A planetary retrograde is always non-static and continually moving, evolving. It's reviewing and throwing off. So the sign and house will define how it's manifesting. The opposite sign and house will give us clarity, answers, expressions. And anytime we have a transiting planet retrograde, it's always related back and understood through the natal planetary archetype. In this case, even though we have Venus retrograde in Scorpio, Libra, which is going to affect a lot of relationships, you're still going to relate it back to wherever your natal Venus is by house, sign, and aspects. Now, if you were someone who was born with Venus retrograde, then you can experience a temporary harmony during transiting Venus retrograde. If you're born with Venus retrograde, you have been throwing off old relationship patterns this entire lifetime. In general, Venus retrograde, and these next two slides are just Venus retrograde in general, but Venus retrograde in Scorpio pointing to the polarity Taurus, which Venus rules, and Venus retrograde in Libra, which Venus also rules. These next few slides are going to get a little repetitious because the archetypes are repeating themselves generically with Venus retrograde, and then specifically with the signs that this retrograde cycle is taking place through. So when Venus is retrograde, it's about new ways of learning to relate to ourselves and then to others. So status quo relating patterns are no longer acceptable. This includes the relating patterns you have with yourself. You're wanting to change something about them. Something's frustrating you. And you're becoming aware of, I always, say this about myself, or I always do this with myself. And it becomes more conscious to change it. So all relationships, inner and outer from personal to collective, are undergoing changes. Venus retrograde will create an individual alienation because we're turning inward. We're turning inward to discover what our own unique values are. And from those values come what we determine to be our own essential needs, necessary to survive and necessary to relate to others in the world. Venus is values, and from our values come our needs, and from our needs come what we desire, and Mars we act upon. Venus retrograde, new levels of self-love and self-acceptance. Your relationships outside of self are only as good as your relationship inside with yourself. So Venus retrograde is about reaching for new levels of self-reliance. Rulership of Taurus in the second house. It's about evolving our talents that allow us to work and in today's world receive resources, i.e. money, in order to pay for food, clothing, and shelter, that allow us to build up our own resources. This is in general, again, every time Venus is retrograde, regardless of the signs or houses or aspects it makes for you. So one more time, Venus retrograde in general, you are reviewing your own talents to survive, and you're reviewing your values around resources. We'll look at this in slides that come along, but think about this for a moment on the collective scale and the extremes of wealth we have going on. Venus retrograde in general is social alienation. Individual is the Taurus second, social is the Libra seventh. So we start to review and question how we and others relate and put our lives together into relationships. One-on-one, and we'll do this collectively. When Venus is retrograde, collective value systems are reevaluated and evolved. For instance, is it okay with this Venus retrograde cycle to, joke and laugh and make fun of someone who gets the courage to come forth and expose an abuser? Not mentioning any names yet. If you have, again, natal Venus retrograde, then there's a lifetime of doing all of this. And Jeffrey Green's teachings would always say that natal Venus retrograde is orientated towards Aquarian type relationships. Uranus and its rulership of Aquarius in the 11th house is learning how to break free from consensus and individuate, to be the group of one, to be different. And that's what natal Venus retrograde is doing. I can't settle for the typical relationship pattern in my society. I have got to find the relationship patterns that work for me. And that's how it's come to be called Aquarian type relationships for natal Venus retrograde. Transiting Venus retrograde, we're all experiencing that for the 6 weeks that Venus is retrograde. Now, of course, we can have distortions in astrology with any archetype, any soul, anytime. And distortions of Venus retrograde, we're going to go to the extremes of those Venus words: jealousy, defensiveness, possessiveness, control, neediness, the role inequalities, the expectations and idealisms that we'll put out there onto a partner. And what's happening here is all this is being exposed so that hopefully we can make it more conscious and actually heal from it, to heal from these distorted archetypes of Venus. Now, let's look specifically at Venus retrograde in Scorpio. This is renegotiating our intimate commitments from hello to goodbye to evolving a new renewal. Repeating the marriage vows, so to speak. And so Venus retrograde in Scorpio is going to expose wherever there is power over or under issues, wherever we have a dominating partner and a partner who's allowing themselves to be dominated. Those extremes are going to come to the surface to hopefully be renegotiated. The abused wife who says, I will not put up with this anymore, or I will leave you. And again, when I say a specific gender, by no means do I mean prejudice. We can have the wife abusing the husband just as easily. We'll have all kinds of sexuality wounds that may resurface. There can be old memories that surface up. There can be in unequal giving and receiving sexually in a relationship, and one spouse brings it up and says, excuse me, I'd like to have some changes here. And of course, what happens when two people come together in any type of intimate setting? They have a tendency to share their resources. And via that polarity, Taurus, which is self-resources, Scorpio is shared resources. And so we can have money issues come up during Venus retrograde in Scorpio. Someone hoards and another person does all the giving. Or we can have the relationship duties change. If you're in an intimate relationship, different gender, same gender, who's in charge of dishes? Who's in charge of laundry? Who's in charge of putting gas in the car? Excuse me. My dear sweetie is going to get up tomorrow morning and take his mom to a doctor's appointment, and his 85-year-old mother cannot put gas in her own car. They are a parent-child relationship. However, it is an intimate relationship. At 85, we've just decided, no, I don't think I'm going to show mom how to fill up the gas tank. I'm just going to do it for her. But in another situation, it doesn't matter what the relationship duties are. there's all kinds of things to be negotiated with Venus retrograde, especially in Scorpio. How do we share those relationship duties? Now, Scorpio relates to the dual desire nature, all of the separating desires and the returning desire to no source. All of that comes up with this Venus retrograde within ourself and with others. And what is one of the most strongest desires in Scorpio? To have that soulmate. And so we're reviewing not only how we want to be in relationship, but we can review who we want to be in relationship with. Venus retrograde in general can bring up old lovers, and Venus retrograde in Scorpio can specifically bring up old lovers, memories of them, things that we review in our head, or they can actually pick up the phone or find us on social media. They can pop in, to go, oh, hey, let's review these issues again. What will also happen with Venus retrograde in Scorpio is there will be the exposure of new desires. And in natural law, these new desires can also be separating desires, because it's in natural law, we have to exhaust the separating desires. We exhaust the desire for a lover, for a car, for a job, for children, etc. And so we can become aware of new values coming through that will then create new desires for us. So Venus retrograde in Scorpio in general, what are the desires that are just fading away? And what are the new desires that are coming up for you? Leroy, I think, say, Leroy, if you're downstairs, someone just pulled up to our driveway. Venus retrograde in Scorpio, it's also, as I said before, possible for old lovers from this life and past lives to show up. I have a tendency to say, however, you want to proceed cautiously. When we have these old lovers, and old lovers from past lives, they can show up and appear as someone new. But that instant attraction, that love at first sight, that's how you know, zing, ooh, I've known this person before. Take it slow, because the intent is to heal old wounds. And it's possible that you may find you have evolved and your values have changed to the point that that relationship will no longer satisfy you. It's not an absolute. You can have the old lover from high school show up and you get back together. You can have a past life love show up and you can spend the rest of this life together. I have a tendency to say, if someone new comes along during Venus retrograde, take it slow. See if they're still there when Venus is direct. See if they're still there when Venus gets post shadow. Of course, confrontations, Scorpio word, they are going to arise wherever we are clinging to any old values, old desires, or old relationships. And I don't just mean a relationship with another person. It can be a relationship with an apartment. It can be a relationship, with a car that's breaking down. And it's done its distance, but don't want to let it go. Don't need a new car payment. But guess what? It has ran its course, and if we cannot see that old leaving, that fixed water, the fixed emotion, Scorpio, they'll build up with this Venus retrograde until there's some type of confrontation. It's exposing our resistance to evolution, to change. And one of the best things to do, especially as Venus retrogrades back into Libra, is to actually listen, because what will be exposed here is an insecurity. Scorpio is where we merge with whatever we perceive we don't have. And whatever we merge with, be it a person, be it a job, be it a vehicle, be it a bank account, you know, we can get overly attached to it rather than merging, metamorphosing, and going back to Taurian self-reliance. So you want to pay attention to any insecurities that will come up here, especially as in a few slides here, and we look at Uranus in Taurus, which is exposing those insecurities for 7 years. And so it's going to show us where we've got to go over to that Taurian self-reliance to make the changes however necessary. Here's the distortions that Venus retrograde in Scorpio. Let's see if you recognize these Scorpio words. Obsessive, compulsive, possessive, jealousy, attachment, control issues, power grabs, sexual violence, sexuality as power, patriarchal dominance, wealth extremes. Seen any of those archetypes in the news lately? And I wanted to look for a picture here that was not just male, female. And 1 in 10 men will experience sexual assault in their lifetime. By the way, our local newspaper up here in little western South Dakota, front page of our paper today, October 3rd, 2018, we just had a Catholic priest arrested on 2 accounts of sexual something with a minor. So, some child spoke up to parents. Parents told the sheriff's department. Sheriff's department contacted the Catholic diocese, if I'm pronouncing it that right. They investigated, and the priest was arrested today. So we'll see whether he pleads. We'll see whether or not there's a trial. But I looked at the front page of the paper and went, wow, interesting. The polarity of Taurus on the ultimate level is learning to value ourselves in order to stand in our own power. Not power over or power under, but to empower ourselves. Self-empowerment, because we value ourselves. And when that's where we come from, then we empower others. We don't want power over anyone else. We won't let anyone else dominate us. We give a helping hand up. And so the polarity in Taurus is always all of those Venus self words. Self-love, self-reliance, self-acceptance, self-worth, self-sex. This is really going inward and emphasizing learning to have a relationship with ourselves. One of the other things that the polarity points to with Taurus is how our value systems are changing in every single area of our life. If you don't value children, you don't care to become a mother or a father. If you don't value lots of money, you're not going to live in a McMansion. So how are your value systems changing over the next 6 weeks? Obviously, your values are going to be changing around relationships, Scorpio, Libra, but it's going to point to your value systems for you and what's important to you. And then as you figure out what's most valuable, as you figure out the priorities of your value system, that's going to affect what you need and desire. And it will affect how you want to be in relationship. Maybe you have reached a point in your life where you have, been married 4 times and the current relationship isn't working anymore. And the most important value coming through is I've got to have a relationship with myself. And you may throw off relating or dating for a while. It's going to be unique to each and every single one of us. And of course, though, these value systems are going to include the collective value systems as well. Venus retrograde in Scorpio, polarity Taurus, is going to put its 2 cents in on the Me Too movement that has come to the forefront with Jupiter in Scorpio. I don't think it's going to let up anytime soon. And if you listen to my weekly podcast, the last couple of weeks, I've talked about Pluto in Capricorn and how it's affecting all the gender issues between men and women and having equality in that area. The Venus retrograde is going to bring up the evolution of our collective value systems over sexuality and sexual abuse as well. In natural law, if we have healthy self-sex, the M word, masturbation, if we have sexual self-sufficiency, then it will minimize and eliminate sexual distortions. We won't have these issues of violence, and we won't have these power issues that are being played out on the front stage in the United States with a Supreme Court game. I can't even think of what the word is that they talk about with the nominee going before the Senate to be approved or not. You can just see the well, most of us probably who watch this webinar, it seems pretty self-evident. I'm watching a lot of social media where it is just some pretty strong head in the sand, and it's like, how extreme will it be before we can see the distortion on a conscious level? So polarity Taurus, really work with what you value, including yourself. And then that's going to change how you're going to go forward in your relationship to anything that's manifested on planet Earth. Now, when Venus retrogrades back into Libra, it's going to emphasize those lessons in listening. EA calls Libra the psychology of listening, meaning being able to put yourself in the shoes of another person and actually hear from their perspective. And what happens when we do that? Oh, we learned something new. We don't necessarily have to agree with it, but it might help us be more empathetic in understanding where another person's coming from. We do this individually, we do this collectively. Now, because Libra is that giving and receiving, if all we do is listen, 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 then Venus retrograde in Libra may be it's our turn to speak up. I will no longer be silent. about this situation in our marriage. I will no longer be silent about what happened to me 10 years ago that made me feel ashamed. Venus retrograde in Libra is where we have to acknowledge and accept others, both intimately and in society. We're not all the same, we're different. And when we can acknowledge another person, when we can listen to them, then we're going to understand what they need. Now, this is going to become, or this is especially true if we're in an intimate relationship with a partner. Different genders, same genders. When we're in an intimate relationship, there becomes that tendency to want to project onto that partner and want to give to them what we want to give them versus asking the partner, what would you like to receive? And so to really understand them, we're going to give what they need. And when we make that type of psychological shift, then law of attraction, that's how it comes back to us. The partner starts learning to give us what we actually need. So Venus retrograde in Libra, the communications, this is what comes up to be discussed, to figure out how to change the giving and receiving. If one does more giving, they have to learn how to hold back until it's equal. If one gets all the receiving, they may have to learn how to give a little more. And then it's also learning to understand what society needs on collective levels. And this is a real interesting choice point right now, because all you got to do is go out there and look at politics on the U.S. stage. And I just want to say, as I always do, thank you, international listeners, for listening through my filter as a U.S. citizen. But we got some pretty extreme polarities going on. Is there a way of maturing into being civil with each other? And I have to tell you, I've been working on that one myself over the last couple of days. I had to turn off the media and just go really be with myself. Taurus polarity, Aries polarity, find my own center again. And okay, Kim Marie, you can kind of be aware of where these people are coming from in regards to consensus psychology. Can you just find your center and balance and hold your peace internally without having to yell at the TV set or your phone? So I want you to know I've worked through it myself as well. And so how are we going to really, go about having civil discourse with others in the changes we want to see on planet Earth? And I think one of the ways to really move through it, the homosexuality one is really triggering people. And so I think one of the ways in which we're going to see changes really start to happen is going to come down to the pocketbooks. And I've said this for a long, long time. I don't see the issue between left and right as much as I see it between haves and have-nots. We'll see what happens with that one, this Venus retrograde. And of course, Venus retrograde in Libra, there's a need to explore a diversity of relationships. We're not all the same. Why is that person that way? Why do they relate to that group versus this group? And so we'll do that compare and contrast individually for ourselves to figure out who we are and who we are not. But we'll also look for it collectively. And can we have that acceptance of differences? Can we have that agree to disagree? Let's see how this moves through with this Venus retrograde cycle. And of course, Venus retrograde in Scorpio, Libra. I want to just address EA's perspective on when there's an outside attraction and you're in a primary relationship. There needs to be honesty. And typically, when you're in a primary relationship and you're attracted to someone else, a third party, the famous triangle, that outside attraction represents what's missing in the relationship. And the best way to handle it is to take whatever that attracting pattern is and bring it back into the primary relationship and make an effort there first. And if it doesn't work, or the partner is not interested in evolving the relationship with that new attracting pattern, then you can move to end the primary relationship before moving in to the outside attraction. That's the best way to minimize karma with all parties involved. And what we have a typical tendency to do with all of these patriarchal distortions, oop, I fell in love with the wrong person. Sorry, it wasn't you. Goodbye. And we go on to the next one without ever understanding the archetypes or patterns that were involved. And then we wonder why we run into these serial patterns in relationships. And of course, from evolutionary astrology's perspective, when there is an exchange of sexual fluids, there is an exchange of sexual karma. So before you jump into bed, see whether or not you want that person's karma. So honesty, honesty, honesty. And really being able to, what is it about this outside attraction that attracts me? And what can I do to bring that attracting quality in to my primary relationship? In natural law, Scorpio's marriage. Leo is lovers, Aquarius is friends. Friends become lovers, and when lovers are done with the lesson, they go back to friendship. And it works that way naturally when you have Taurian self-reliance. But we've distorted it for so long, we don't even recognize it anymore. So there will also be a review of all types of equality, review of equality in all types of relationships. So there will be rebellion in general relationships wherever we feel restricted. And this is where we can look at it collectively from a political perspective. Are we going to include or are we going to exclude? Libra being square to Cancer, Capricorn brings up the gender roles, the animus, and of course you see how we are wanting to have the evolution from the traditional roles. And when you look at it from the perspective of reincarnation, which is probably what most of the listeners to this webinar do, we realize as we shift back and forth between male and female and male, if we've had several lifetimes in one gender and we go to the other gender, there's confusion. We can want to go back to the gender we were in for so many lifetimes. And that's what happens with a lot of the same gender situations until we become used to moving over to a new gender. So who's to judge? We also will look at some rebellion in intimate relationship restrictions. So just like we can have things build up pressure and we have the Scorpio confrontations, we can have all kinds of things happen with Libra as well. And Libra's cardinal air. So it can all of a sudden bring change out of the blue. It's been building up, but it appears to come right out of the blue. We can have endings occur. We can have the new beginnings come, short term, long term. Polarity point Aries, all the sexuality issues will arise. Sexuality issues come up with Venus retrograde in general. Scorpio, shared sex, Taurus, self sex, Libra, Aries, Aries ruled by Mars. The instinctual sexual desire is very strong in Aries and Taurus. It's going to be emphasized with this Venus retrograde cycle. How's it happening for you in your intimate relationships? What we want to do when Venus retrogrades back into Libra Aries is to be able to balance the Arian freedom with the Libran commitment. And it's, you know, the woundedness is this extreme of all or nothing, rather than recognizing it's an ebb and flow that goes back and forth. Excuse me, honey, I just got to go be alone for a little bit and find myself again. I'll be back as I figure myself out. And so can you honor that balancing of time alone with time in relationship if you're in some type of committed relationship? Now, that Venus retrograde polarity pointing towards Aries, again, squares Aries, Libra to Cancer, Capricorn. It's going to bring up those male and female roles. We're going to have that defense of the traditional roles versus evolving with how our values are changing. So we'll have this on a personal level. It's quite possible with this Venus retrograde that somebody could all of a sudden be going, oh, wait a minute, I had a heterosexual relationship because that's what my parents conditioned me with. And I think I really like my same gender. Will they break free? Will we judge it? If you look at it from a collective level, we got a pretty strong defensiveness going on about boys will be boys, blah, blah. Aries, recognizing the need for self-love and self-value as well. Aries, me, myself, and I. If we don't have a relationship with ourselves, we're not going to have one with anybody else. Those relationships with others, Libra, are only as good as the one we have with ourselves. And then, of course, quickly, sexuality issues can be coming up, changing, evolving. How well are you talking about it? Can you be sexually self-sufficient here as well? And with Aries, Aries can, you know, it's cardinal fire. So that sexual energy can get very sporadic and erratic. It can blow hot and it can blow cold. And if we're not having really good communications about it in a relationship, we get hurt. They don't love us. They don't think we're attractive. Phew, all kinds of things can come up. So communications, Libra, pointing towards Aries. And can we listen without interrupting? And can our partner do the same for us? And can we find that area and courage to speak up and say the things we're scared to say? And it points towards having the freedom to act upon whatever instinctual desires are evolving out of us. I gave an example with intimate relationships and gender changing, but it can be instinctual desires anywhere. A desire to go back to school, an evolving desire to leave our job and start our own business. If we're in a relationship, it shakes up the relationship when you don't have that steady income anymore. How well are you balancing that freedom to act with any relationship commitments? So, getting a picture a little bit about how Venus retrograde works for you generically, and then with the retrogrades through Scorpio, Libra, with polarities in Taurus, Aries. I found this one this afternoon. The enemy of feminism isn't men, it's patriarchy. And patriarchy is not men, it is a system. And women can support the system of patriarchy, just as men can support the fight for gender equality. Justine Musk. I have no idea who she is. I think Justine is a female name. But I saw that and I went, oh, yes, this is exactly what's being played out on center stage in Washington, D.C. and around the country and being exploited by Donald Trump. So, this was just a little meme that was on Facebook, although it didn't have that background. I put that in there. If you want to, give her credit and spread it around Facebook. All right, here are the Scorpio retrograde dates again. We're now going to look at some of the specific aspects that this Venus retrograde will make. And I'm going to stop and take a drink of water. And I think I heard Leroy run upstairs, so he's not there to open the lines. But when he comes back, by all means, if you have questions, you can type them into the Q&A panel. If you want to ask something live, you can raise your hand. Leroy will see, he will answer what he knows. If you want to interact, we can. And if Leroy's not noticing you right away, just type into the Q&A panel, because I think he went up and down. I think the neighbors delivered us some garden produce, but he was down and he went back up again. my third house Pluto sweetie. So here's Venus stationary retrograde on Friday, October 5th. And I have a tendency to use 0-degree Aries rising charts so that the chart is generic and it works anywhere on planet Earth. I do base it time-wise from where I am in Rapid City, South Dakota. Perhaps you are familiar with the major configuration that we have going on all through this Venus retrograde cycle. Venus, as it goes retrograde at 1050 Scorpio, is within orb of squaring the transiting nodes of the moon. Venus is going to have these 3 oppositions to Uranus, which was retrograde at 1 Taurus, and also square the nodes of the moon. And when Venus goes retrograde, it is within orb of making last quarter square to Mars, which Venus does 3 times as well. So this is probably the major configuration of this Venus retrograde taking place in the fixed modality. Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, Aquarius. As you can see from the picture here, it is just a tug of war. And so what will build up to an eruption? I mean, we've been watching it already. If you've been paying any attention to the Senate confirmation hearings for a Supreme Court judge here in the last few weeks. And with Venus retrograde, I don't see it calming down any. This is going to carry right over into the U.S. midterm elections that will take place during Venus retrograde. What I do want to point out here is Uranus in Taurus is exposing insecurities. And with it square the nodes, we can traumatize ourselves, or we can individualize, we can detach, individualize, and break free. Venus square the nodes is going to expose the insecurities in our relationships with other people and resources. Intimate relationships, shared resources, same thing. Who's going to be traumatized? Who's going to be breaking free? Where are we going to have the love triangles? Where are we going to recognize we must love ourselves and really find that common foundation of friendship and intimacy, as well as being able to have that relationship with ourselves? Stay tuned. It's just like a pressure cooker. The good old tug of war, as you can see on the screen. And when it's the fixed modality, something sooner or later breaks free, explodes, crumbles. It's, again, how well can you detach, understand the larger picture, and find the courage to make whatever changes are necessary for you. Now, as I said, Venus and Uranus are square the nodal axis throughout this retrograde. It's going to bring out that I'm right, you're wrong. How well can we listen, Libra? It will intensify all the struggles with values, needs, desires, and of course the fixed mentality of Aquarius. U.S. midterm elections take place within this. It will intensify the Sun-Scorpio confrontations and eruptions. The U.S., I don't know so much about other countries, but the United States had many times local, statewide, and national has elections when the sun is in Scorpio. And it's fixed water. And so there's just these emotional eruptions between winners and losers that go back and forth and back and forth. One of the other things to recognize, though, is the nodal axis literally changes signs on election day. The North Node is going to go from Leo to 30 degrees Cancer. The South Node is going to go from Aquarius to 30 degrees Capricorn. So I drew up the charts for Washington, D.C. here, as Washington is the United States capital. I drew the charts up for when the polls open at 7 a.m. and I drew the chart up for when the polls close at 7 p.m. And here again, you can see the Venus-Uranus opposition, square to the nodes, polls open with the moon in late Libra. And here's the chart for when the polls close with the moon having moved into Scorpio. I kind of looked at this and I'm, regardless of whether or not there's a shift of Democrats taking control of the House and or Senate, 2018, 2020, 2022, we're going to have Saturn and Pluto very close. Saturn's balsamic Pluto 2018, it'll be balsamic 2020, it'll be new phase 2022. But Saturn balsamic Pluto, the South Node balsamic Pluto, I don't know. My intuitive hit is that there's a changing of the guard. It just is going to depend, though, on a lot of factors and who's most motivated. It's going to depend on a lot of the independents if you look at this politically, because the Donald Trump's base is pretty aligned with Donald Trump. That's why that's the only place he goes for his political rallies. He has to get his fix to be top dog. He doesn't go to Libra Libra. He doesn't go to the liberal strongholds. What will change things is the independents and the women. And I thought, I sometimes will look at moon, I'll look at other things that change, but isn't it interesting that the polls open at 29 degrees moon Libra, the 0 Aquarius, but here's the polls closed. And so this was another factor for me. The gender issues are going to make a difference in this election, just like they're going to make a difference in 2020. I don't think you can ignore half the population gender-wise. I'll try to leave it at that for politics, and you can kind of see it for yourselves, but I thought it was quite revealing with Venus retrograde and reviewing what we value. And that, remember I said the Venus heliacal rising at 29.5 Libra is going to be square the nodes almost all the way through the Venus retrograde, but pretty intensely in the US midterm elections as well. It just really points to these gender inequality and Venus retrograde sexuality issues being in the forefront of this election, as those issues have been rising since the 2016 presidential election. Now, here are the aspects that Venus makes during its retrograde cycle. It aspects every single planet except Pluto. We know Venus aspects the moon. It moves so fast, I don't bring those into the webinars. And we know the highlight of the Venus retrograde is the interior conjunction. But Venus has Mercury has 3 different aspects to Venus. Venus makes 2 different aspects to Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Chiron, Uranus, Neptune, and of course, as we spoke, the nodal axis. This is an extremely active Venus retrograde. You can have a Venus retrograde, it's always going to aspect Sun, Mercury, and Mars. And then maybe 1 or 2 outer planets. This is a very strong, active Venus retrograde. So let's look at these aspects. First of all, here's the interior conjunction to the Sun, October 26th at 3 degrees Scorpio. You can see the Venus-Uranus opposition, but we also will have Mars moving away from the south node, squaring Mercury-Jupiter, which there's a grand trine that starts to come along throughout this Venus retrograde. So we just don't have Venus opposing Uranus squaring Mars with the squares to the opposition or the nodal axis. We also have that grand trine. In this case, it's going to be between Jupiter, Chiron, and the nodal axes. And it's going to go between, you know, the water and north node fire, north node earth. So that's kind of, you look at the trine as a relief valve, but you look at Chiron retrograding back into Pisces one more time, and I can't help but notice those who have been victimized really feeling the energy right now. And how can we not notice Jupiter finishing up with Scorpio and all of the sexuality issues that are in the forefront? And the North Node at 0 degrees Leo going, what about me? Now we do what about me from the distorted Donald Trump angle, who has no ability to emotionally empathize with anybody else. We also look at it from the 0 degrees Leo. I need to love myself. I need to stand up for myself. I'm not going to be a victim anymore. There's so much stirred up right here. Stay tuned. We'll see how it unfolds over the next couple of months. But again, when Venus retrogrades over the Sun, this is the death by intent, okay? And this is the time to get the maximum insights into the Venus retrograde. So that's 3 degrees Scorpio. Review of shared value systems, inclusive versus exclusive, sexuality and intimacy insights. Let's not forget money and resources distributions. For instance, the fight for 15. Venus is turning retrograde, and Amazon came out as, you know, the largest employer in the United States, raising its minimum wage to $15. Somebody doing the right thing. And then, of course, right behind that one more time, the heliacal rising. By the time we see Venus as a morning star, it's about 10 degrees past the Sun. So we have Sun at 10 degrees to Venus being at 30 degrees Libra. Libra, fairness, equality, balance versus extremes, the psychology of listening, gender roles evolving. Let's see where all this is at as we get to the end of October, as we get to the heliacal rising November 1st, and as we get to election day November 6th, which is when again the nodal axis shifts to Cancer, Capricorn. Mercury and Venus go from conjunction to sextiles, back and forth, okay? They never get beyond that sextile with each other. What we're going to have happen here during this Venus retrograde is Mercury's going to pull ahead of Venus, and then it's going to be ahead of Venus until next summer. But probably what I want to point out here is the day that Venus goes direct is the day that Mercury goes retrograde in Sagittarius. And so what we're going to have happening here, the truth versus lies communications are going to be extended into relationships, both personal and collective, through the Mercury retrograde. And Mercury, while it goes retrograde November 16th, it's going to go direct December 6th, 27 Scorpio. So stay tuned. It's like Mercury is going to take this Venus retrograde and stretch it out, but we also might get to some truth here. Communicating what we are learning from our evolving self-love and outer love efforts. And when when Mercury's ahead of Venus, which it will be until next July, the conscious mind is always having to slow down and reconsider its value system. Of course, if we want to distort the lies, we want to convert someone to our perspective, our actions don't match up to our words, the love triangles can start to get involved here, and so are those famous power grabs. Venus and Mars, I told you Venus has two different aspects to Mars. Okay, so the pre-shadow, the retrograde, and the post-shadow. They have a cycle that's anywhere from 23 to 28 months, and they'll have 1 to 3 conjunctions, and they'll have 1 opposition when Mars is retrograde. That's because when Mars is retrograde and opposite the sun, Venus doesn't get far enough away from the sun. And so that's why they're typically only 1 opposition with a Mars retrograde. But you can see where they had their last conjunctions, the opposition. Here's the aspects. In general, Venus-Mars is that courage to honor our own evolving relationship needs and desires, inner, outer. As Venus makes waning trines to Mars, Venus will be reviewing old karma mates. We can have relationship rewards from prior efforts, or we can remain stuck in old relating patterns, the ease of resistance with the trines. However, Venus will make waning squares to Mars. Remember, Venus Scorpio, Mars Aquarius. So all of those old relationship beliefs and values come to a head to be reviewed, waning or last quarter square released. So what is most important to me in my relationships? And because there will be 6 Venus-Mars aspects through this retrograde cycle, it will demand action. We can't just have a changing of our values, needs, desires. We have to act upon those changes. So the trines might bring a little resistance, and the squares are going to bring the tensions to act. So knowing this, make the effort to change. as you become aware of what you desire to change. Venus is waning semi-sextiles to Jupiter until Venus makes its conjunction in mid-Sag in January. So here, Venus and Jupiter are going to recognize relating truths that can no longer be ignored. The waning semi-sextile is balsamic phase 330-degree aspect. And so it's really lends itself to right brain and intuition. And so you want to honor any intuitive hits that you get in your consciousness, regardless of what the spoken words are. Oh, I promise to be faithful. I'm not going to look at another person. I will be faithful. And you're getting this strong intuitive hit that there's no meaning to the words. Trust your intuition. Somebody lies about the resources in some type of relationship. I'll pay you back. I promise. I will pay you back. And you get the intuitive hit that, you know, those are just words and they're desperate. Your choice to give the money, but give the money as a gift and know that. And the law of attraction here, if you are as honest as you can be, if you are standing in your personal truth as best as you can, then that vibration will come back to you. If you are honest with someone else, their lie to you will be exposed. And boy, I speak from experience on this one with karma mates. When I learned this in my metaphysical studies 20, 30 years ago, it was like, oh, it really allowed my 8th house Pluto, Scorpio soul, to reach over to the 2nd house, self-reliance, Taurus, and go, oh boy, that's just relaxing. Okay, I'll just be as honest as I can, and that honesty is going to come back to me one way or another. This is what Venus is learning with Jupiter, and this is going to intensify when Jupiter goes into Scorpio. Stay tuned. Future webinar on that one here next month. Venus is going to make 3 waning sextiles to Saturn. And Venus-Saturn as a planetary pair is learning to have absolute self-responsibility. No more projecting security outside of ourselves onto the other person or onto the job or onto this resource, that resource. It's really going, I am completely, I have this saying, absolute self-responsibility creates absolute freedom. I put that to Pisces as the last archetype, but it works here for Venus, Saturn. And if you're doing that, it's going to allow for you to make those changes that are necessary, whether they're beginnings or endings. Now, you know, Scorpio, Capricorn can just get a little, you know, insecure and want to control. And so we've got to go into that Taurian self-reliance and that Aryan initiation to take care of ourselves. And that'll minimize the power struggles because they can be here because old realities are having to give way to changing dynamics and values in the world. And just look at it collectively. It's making a lot of people defensive and wanting to just cling to yesterday because they're kind of afraid of these changing dynamics in the world. We can have an exposure of how unequal money and resources are, which, by the way, I was going to put this in. Maybe I can make a note here and put it in the PowerPoint slide. I subscribe to The Nation magazine.
thenation.com, and they had an article on the inequality industry and how nonprofits and philanthropies and colleges are getting into this industry of studying inequality. And the whole article, well, are we going to study it or are we going to do something about it? And I just thought it was an interesting article. So more and more exposure of these extremes of inequality, and Venus waiting Saturn, what are we going to do about it? And of course, the old Scorpio to Capricorn, the sexual distortions and the patriarchal distortions that can come from Capricorn, you know, we're already seeing this stuff come about. Stay tuned. Story isn't written yet. Venus will make a waning inconjunct the 210-degree aspect with Chiron. And the first one's in Aries, and then the last two, Chiron, as we talked about earlier, backs up into Pisces for one more retrograde. So here we're reviewing beliefs and values about outer relationships. The outer inconjunct, or quincunx, as my symbol is, the 210 degrees, that's outer adjustments. Waxing inconjunct, inner adjustments, 150 degrees. Outer inconjunct 210 degrees, outer adjustments in relationships. So where do we have conditional love going on? I will love you if. Where do we have unhealthy boundaries? Libra and Pisces both get into those. Where do we feel any deep inner aloneness? Nobody loves me. This is where we have unresolved spiritual needs and desires, and where we need to have that relationship with universal source. And if you've been following me for any length of time, here's my famous quote for relationships. The relationship we have with ourselves is identical to the relationship we have with God Goddess. And the relationship we have with God Goddess is identical to the relationship we have with ourself. So really working on that inner relationship with Source will then allow you to make whatever those adjustments are in your outer relationships to feel better. Here's the Venus oppositions to Uranus. And as you can see, the retrograde one occurs right after the interior conjunction, October 26th, 3 degrees Scorpio. It's the day before the heliacal rising, November 1st, 29.5 Libra. And it's really close to the U.S. midterm election, November 6th. What is Uranus and Taurus doing for 7 years? It's exposing insecurity in every area of our life, especially around resources and relationships. It's showing us where we need to develop deep self-love, self-acceptance, self-reliance, so that we can provide for ourselves and we can hold healthy intimacy. So Venus and Uranus can be the surprise quotient, is that the way you pronounce that, in this retrograde cycle. So I say expect the surprises, and it's just going to reveal what is ready to be confronted and metamorphosed in our life. And the more that we reach for the Taurian polarity of inner security with Venus retrograde, the more we can make those outer evolutionary changes in whatever way they are being presented to us. And you know, on the ultimate level, you know, Scorpio is literal death and rebirth. There's multiple symbols for literal death and rebirth. But you know, traditional astrology, what do they say? Sex, death, and taxes. So covering merging sexuality, covering the literal death and rebirth, and covering the shared resources. There can be some of that with the Venus opposed Taurus. You know, most astrologers are humanistic, psychological, spiritual astrologers, and most evolutionary astrologers recognize I'm not going to play God. Who knows whether it's going to be literal or figurative, but that would be the ultimate surprise that Venus Uranus would bring for us. Venus is going to have waning sesquisquadrates to Neptune. This is the 225-degree aspect. This is where Venus moves from full phase to disseminating phase with Neptune. Venus, known as the lower octave of love, Neptune, the higher octave of love. Human love has to figure out how to be compatible with universal love. Being able to see that divine in everyone with healthy boundaries, Libra, Pisces again. Recognizing where we're substituting our human relationships for a relationship with Source. Source will dissolve the human relationship when necessary because it will not accept a substitute for itself. So, excuse me. Here we're learning to redefine beliefs, values, desires around that outer world of relationships. And we will do this individually, collectively. This is where we've got to look at any sense of victimization and victorization, being dominated and dominating. And what we're really wanting to do again is that struggle, sesquisquadrate, to create fairness, equality, and balance in all relating areas. Gotta take a drink again. Comments or questions? I think I asked people to type in the Q&A board when you were away from your desk at one point, Leroy. As we had spoken earlier, Venus is going to have 3 squares to the nodal axis during its retrograde cycle. And at the same time, Uranus is finally going to have 1 square to the nodes just a couple of days before the election, November 4th, 0 Taurus, North Node 0 Leo, South Node 0 Aquarius. Start to put that together. Learning to meet our own needs versus projecting onto another. So to whatever degree, again, this is fixed modality, okay? Whatever degree, we've got to have the power and the power over. What it's really revealing is the degree to which we are insecure underneath the surface. The degree to which we are really working to empower ourselves and others is the degree to which we are working to create a healthy self-reliance. Don't need to play games if I can rely on myself and take care of myself. Now, I think that as we go through this Venus retrograde cycle with these squares to the nodes, we are going to have all kinds of exposure of money and resource inequalities, and it's going to raise the issue again and again and again of how we are going to redistribute those resources. The question is, will we see Congress trying to pass more laws, creating more resource inequalities? If so, we can expect that pendulum swing to come back even greater when Pluto finally makes it into Aquarius. I think there will be a pendulum swing regardless. the question is Jupiter finishes up in Scorpio and then moves into Sag and reveals more and more things. You know, what are we going to do about it? Stay tuned. We shall see. Those in power are going to grab as much of it as they can because they know that they are on or in the minority. Now, here is the US chart just briefly. I use the Gemini rising chart, 2:13 a.m. for July 4th. And as if you don't know this, the US, regardless of which July 4th chart you use, the US has its south node at 6.5 Aquarius, north node 6.5 Leo. It's had a nodal return here a few months back, and Venus retrograde will square the US natal nodes 3 times. Uranus squared the natal nodes a little earlier. The Mars retrograde cycle went back and forth over the US natal node 3 times. So it's really stirring up the collective emotions in the US. Interestingly, when I made the bi-wheel with the transits, okay, for the Venus interior conjunction on October 26th. Interestingly, that is the day that Mars will go over the US moon in the 2:13 a.m. chart. The Sibley chart has the moon later Aquarius, so Mars will go over that in November. And so there's a lot of public discourse going on here on a collective level. You know, I just really hope, energize that all of the people who want to see gender equality, who want to see honesty and truth, who want to see more equitable resource distributions are going to show up for this election. That nodal axis is going to still be active on election day as well within orbs. And as we can see here, the transiting south node going to go into Capricorn is going to conjunct the US south node and more things. I have a class coming on the nodal axis in Cancer Capricorn the end of the month. I'll go into detail with those later. Let's just say Venus is really going to be stirring up the value systems in the United States. Stay tuned. We'll see what happens. Venus will be making 3 last quarter squares to Pluto, 3 squares to the nodal axes. It'll be making 3 waxing trines to Venus natally and Jupiter as well. These trines of the Venus retrograde to Venus Jupiter may be some of that defensiveness that clings to the nationalism and the populism, both left and right, but to the yesterday, so to speak. Here's the dates in which all these aspects take place if you want to study that in any detail. And then something I wanted to point out, the last time we had a Venus retrograde in Scorpio Libra was the 2010 midterm elections. And I don't know how many of you remember, but in 2009, 2010, when Obama was elected and Democrats controlled the House and the Senate, they passed the Affordable Care Act for health care. And that was part of what created the rise of the Tea Party and the midterm elections that swung to the Republican Party. In 2010, the Republicans picked up 6 seats in the Senate, and they picked up 63 seats in the House. So, As we move into the midterm elections in 2018, and this Venus retrograde cycle, will it swing to the Democratic Party? Will they recover the House? Will they recover the Senate? How much will the Me Too movement motivate female voters and those voting for fairness and gender equality? Stay tuned. Here we are, cycling around again. Here's Donald Trump's chart set for Queens, New York, June 14th, 46, 10:54 a.m., the 29 or 30 degree Leo rising. Venus is going to make waxing squares to itself in Cancer. It's going to make the waxing squares to Pluto, waxing sextiles to Mercury, waxing sextiles to Mars, waxing trines to Mercury. This Venus retrograde cycle is going to take place in Donald Trump's third house of communications. Probably don't have to tell listeners to this webinar how much he says whatever he wants. You just don't trust anything that comes out of this person's mouth. Whatever he says today, he'll swing 180 degrees tomorrow with this natal signature here in Gemini, Sag. Excuse me. Sometimes my throat gets a little dry at the end of 2 hours. Here's the dates of all of those. And here's what I kind of wanted to point out. That first Venus square to Pluto was September 29th. And here's the retrograde. And so within the space of less than 2 weeks, his natal Pluto is 10 Leo, 3 minutes. Venus is going retrograde 10 Scorpio, 50 minutes. So Venus is stationary retrograde exactly square Pluto the soul. And if you weren't watching any of the media, yesterday, October 2nd, the New York Times had a huge expose, 100,000 pages of documents, tax returns, and just all kinds of legal filings. And what they're basically revealing is that the Trump family committed fraud in passing its wealth along to the family. Remember Donald Trump saying he got a small loan of $1 million from his dad? His dad literally gave him $60 million. Over the course of his father's, of working with his father and his father's death, Trump has received $400 million from his dad in today's dollars. So he wasn't a self-made millionaire. It was all given to him. And what this expose reveals is how much his father bailed him out when he failed at this business, that business, this business, that business. I think we'll see more of this coming along during the Venus retrograde. The statute of limitations has ran out for bringing criminal charges for a lot of this, but the, excuse me, the, I don't know which one, here it is. The IRS can bring about civil charges. And of course, the state of New York can investigate and bring about charges on a statewide level. So this Venus retrograde may turn out to be quite interesting. And if we're going to look at this, then we want to pay attention to what may come about in December, when Venus will make the third and final square to Pluto. So here's the exposure. Here's where we might start to see some resolution of things. Leroy told me today that the Republican House Ways and Means Committee
passed some rule to forbid us of looking at Donald Trump's tax returns. Okay, I had to put a cough drop in. Is telling me I've talked too much. So I think I might have to finish up here, but I got just a couple more slides. Here's the Venus stationary direct. And again, that grand trine starts to come into play all the way through the Venus retrograde cycle, stronger and stronger as Venus finishes up and goes direct. The ultimate Venus retrograde condition is identification with God, Goddess, the ultimate value. Here is what I had to practice today as I was getting triggered with everything that was going on. I'm going to let you look at it on the screen. And Leroy, if you're listening, maybe you can finish up for me.
I'm not so sure I can do that. The Ho'oponopono prayer is a sacred Hawaiian prayer about love and caring for one another. And simply, it is so simple. It's indigenous and it's very simple. And it's exactly how you're reading it on your screen. I love and care about you. I'm sorry for whatever the offense was or defense. Please forgive me. I forgive you. And of course, Cam, her little disclosure down at the bottom, we perceive that there's changing demographics. It's a powerful thing coming into our country, and there's lots of resistance towards that, and we just need to accept it. Well, I hope Kim's okay, but I hear her coughing up there. Are you okay, honey?
Well, I got a cough drop that's coating, and that's what I needed.
Well, it's time to finish up, honey. You did a lot of work. Thank you.
So here's my classes coming up over this fall. As you can see, you'll get notice of those. And then at the tail end, all of the Venus, excuse me, all of the Venus aspects that I mentioned in these slides. Here they are in a date order for anybody who, except for the Mercury ones, I don't have Mercury in there. But here's the Venus to all the outer planets. And so here these are if you'd like to look at them. And yes, so apologies. Usually I can make it a little bit further. So coating my throat. Comments or questions with anything, Leroy? I'll do my best to answer, or you can answer anybody.
Just relax. You don't have to talk right now. It's okay. The slides will all be included in the recording. Okay, so be looking for the follow-up email from GoToWebinar service. I'll have the recording attached to that, and of course I'll create a PDF and send that out to everybody as well. In fact, there'll be a link in that same email from GoToWebinar. There'll be a link to the PDF, so you'll get all of the slides, the video recording, plus the audio files in one fell swoop. So there you go. So I think I'll just close for Kim Marie. Thank you so much, everybody, for participating in the forecasting webinar tonight. Venus, as you can see, it's going to be really alive and powerful. Venus retrograde. I've had Kim Marie's chart out here. I've had my chart. We're getting hit pretty good with oppositions and squares. And until next time, move with joy and passion on that never-ending journey to the core of your soul. And thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.